Okay, so are you curious about Russia and Bitcoin and if they're actually using it to dodge sanctions? Well, we dug through a ton of articles to get you some answers, and it's honestly way more complicated than just a yes or no.
It really is. What's fascinating to me is how this whole situation, it kind of feels like a potential turning point for global finance.
Oh, yeah.
You think about it, you've got this major world power actively looking for ways to operate outside the normal system, the one that's always been dominated by the US dollar.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a real-world test to see how much power Bitcoin actually has. So, Okay, quick recap for everyone listening. Western sanctions after that whole Ukraine conflict have really squeezed Russia. Like they're basically locked out of most regular banking. So they've got to find workarounds.
Yeah.
And that's where Bitcoin comes in.
Yeah, they're not just looking for workarounds, they're really integrating it. Like there's a new law in Russia that actually lets crypto miners there use Bitcoin directly for international trade.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal. And this isn't just some quiet little experiment either, right? Putin himself has been making statements that sound a lot like,
Oh, yeah.
like what Trump used to say about Bitcoin, that whole thing about how nobody can control it.
Yeah.
And now Putin's basically suggesting, why even bother holding on to dollar reserves if they can be frozen so easily?
Right. It's a pretty direct challenge to the dollar's global dominance.
Yeah.
And for it to be coming from a country like Russia, it carries a lot of weight. That's why everybody's watching this so closely.
For sure. Okay, so let's break down this new law. Russia's finance minister, Anton Silanov, he went on TV and basically said, look, these Bitcoin transactions are already happening, and we expect to see way more next year. That sounds pretty serious.
It does.
So what's the strategy here? Are they actually aiming to replace the dollar entirely for Russia? Or is this more of a short-term thing?
Well, I think they're definitely feeling the pressure from those sanctions, and even transactions with countries that haven't imposed sanctions, like China or Turkey. Even those are getting harder. Banks are just afraid to do business with Russia at this point because they don't want to get caught in the crossfire with Western regulators.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Bitcoin gives them this kind of back door, a way to operate outside those normal channels. Because it's decentralized. It doesn't care about borders. It's pretty clever. But can it actually work on a large scale?
That is the million-dollar question. A lot of experts are raising concerns about whether Bitcoin can truly handle what Russia needs. I mean, imagine trying to replace hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen assets through the crypto market. That's a lot of Bitcoin.
Yeah, one report I read from Chainalysis, they basically said straight up that right now, crypto markets just don't have the liquidity to accommodate those kinds of huge transactions.
Exactly. And then there's the other big issue, Bitcoin's price volatility. It swings up and down so wildly. It makes it super risky for something like international trade. You need stable prices to be able to plan and forecast.
Right. So even though Russia's making this big push with Bitcoin, it seems like there are some serious roadblocks.
There are. And it raises another question. Is this really a genuine attempt by Russia to completely ditch the dollar? Or is this just a temporary fix until they find something better?
That's a good question. Okay, so Russia's making moves, but let's zoom out a little bit and think about the bigger implications here. Could Bitcoin actually become a global reserve currency someday and replace the US dollar completely? I mean, we see those bold predictions everywhere. What do you think?
Well, there are definitely people who see this as the beginning of the end for the dollar's reign. They point to all the downsides of having a centralized system that's controlled by just one country. And they argue that Bitcoin's decentralized nature makes it a fairer and more resilient alternative.
Right. But a lot of people are skeptical too.
Yeah.
Right? They point to the volatility we've already talked about.
Yeah.
And the limited infrastructure, for actually using Bitcoin in everyday life. And just the fact that it's still not widely accepted.
Right. And it's kind of ironic. Some people argue that the very things Bitcoin fans love about it, like the lack of central control, that could actually be its downfall. Without an authority to stabilize it and regulate how it's used, it's just too vulnerable to manipulation and potentially even being used for illegal activities.
It really is kind of a head scratcher. I can see the appeal of a more decentralized system, one that's maybe more democratic in a way.
Yeah.
But the lack of regulation and that potential for chaos, it's a big concern.
It is a valid concern, honestly. I think what we're seeing right now is a live experiment. It's way too early to say definitively whether Bitcoin is just a fad or the future of money.
Yeah, it's high stakes for sure. So even if Bitcoin doesn't completely replace the dollar, do you think it could still significantly disrupt the global financial system?
Absolutely. What Russia's doing is sending a clear signal that they are serious about finding alternatives to the dollar. And they're not the only ones. Other countries. especially those that are wary of U.S. influence or those facing sanctions. They're watching very closely.
Right.
So instead of one single dominant currency, we might be headed towards a world with multiple currencies and systems, all competing with each other.
A multipolar world.
Exactly. And that brings us to a key takeaway from all this. This isn't just a story about Russia and Bitcoin. It's about a potential shift in global power dynamics and how the financial world operates. What we're seeing right now could be the early stages of a massive transformation.
Wow.
And that transformation is already having ripple effects.
Oh, yeah. We're seeing the European Union scrambling to tighten up its crypto regulations in response to Russia's moves.
Right. They're trying to find a balance. They want to encourage innovation in the crypto sector. But they're also worried about preventing sanctions evasion and illegal activities.
Right. It's like trying to fix a leaky boat while you're still out at sea. How do you even manage those two things at the same time? It'll be interesting to see how these regulations develop as more countries start experimenting with crypto.
Yeah, definitely.
And this leads to another important question. What does all of this mean for how we send money across borders in the future?
That's a great point. The whole idea behind Bitcoin is to make those transactions faster and cheaper and more transparent.
Right.
So are we on the verge of a revolution in how we move money internationally? Maybe.
It's possible.
It's definitely within the realm of possibility. Blockchain technology could really streamline cross-border payments, especially for individuals and small businesses who often face high fees and long delays with the traditional system.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard about these services that use blockchain for remittances, and they seem like they could be a game changer for a lot of people, especially in developing countries, where those transfer fees can be a huge burden.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual transactions either. We're also seeing companies exploring the use of crypto for larger-scale international trade settlements. For instance, there have been pilot projects involving companies like Maersk and IBM using blockchain platforms to streamline supply chain management and cross-border payments.
So it sounds like this technology has the potential to not just change who controls the money, but also fundamentally change how global trade works.
That's the key takeaway here. We're potentially seeing a shift in how global commerce is conducted, and crypto is playing a central role. But of course, it's not all smooth sailing.
Right. There have got to be some downsides or risks, especially with something as complex and potentially volatile as crypto.
Of course. Security is a major concern. We've seen some high-profile hacks and thefts of crypto assets, which makes people question the safety and reliability of these systems. And then there's the whole issue of regulatory uncertainty. Governments around the world are still figuring out how to approach crypto, and that lack of clear rules can create confusion and potentially hinder innovation.
Right. And we can't forget about the environmental impact either. Bitcoin mining in particular is incredibly energy intensive, which has raised a lot of concerns about its sustainability.
Yeah, those are all valid points. It's really important to acknowledge these potential downsides and address them proactively if we want the benefits of this technology to outweigh the risks.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for crypto and international trade? Is this a passing fad? Or are we seeing the early stages of a truly transformative technology?
It's hard to predict with certainty, but I think it's safe to say that we're just scratching the surface of what's possible as technology keeps evolving and regulations become clearer. We're likely to see even more innovative applications of crypto in global trade and finance.
Yeah, it's definitely moving fast.
Yeah.
And this whole situation with Russia and Bitcoin, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. It's speeding up innovation and forcing governments and financial institutions to adapt, whether they're ready or not.
It really is. And you know what's especially striking to me is how this whole thing exposes the unintended consequences of sanctions. They were meant to isolate Russia, but they might have accidentally pushed them towards a path that could eventually weaken the very system that imposed those sanctions.
Yeah, it's almost poetic in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've laid out the big picture, the geopolitical implications, and even how this could impact how we move money around the world. But there's one more layer we need to peel back here. What does all of this mean for the United States and its global strategy?
Yeah, this situation is a real curveball for the U.S. They've always had this kind of complicated relationship with cryptocurrency. On the one hand, the U.S. is home to some of the biggest players in the crypto world. But on the other hand, they're also worried about how it could be used for illegal activities and, potentially undermine their financial power.
Right. And now Russia's showing how crypto, specifically Bitcoin, can be used to basically sidestep those sanctions and maybe even chip away at the dollar's dominance. So I'm guessing this has sparked some pretty intense discussions among U.S. policymakers.
Oh, absolutely. It's forcing them to face some tough questions, like how do you support innovation in the crypto space while also protecting national security?
Right.
And how do you regulate it effectively without stifling its growth, but also making sure it's not used against U.S. interests? It's a tricky balancing act, for sure.
It really is. And then there's the impact on U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
If countries like Russia can successfully use crypto to get around sanctions, does that weaken the U.S.'s ability to influence what happens on the global stage?
That's definitely a key concern. The U.S. has relied on sanctions as a major foreign policy tool for decades.
Yeah.
If crypto undermines their effectiveness, it could have significant consequences for their global standing.
Yeah. It's almost like we're seeing this power struggle play out, not just between countries, but between traditional financial systems and this new decentralized world of crypto.
Exactly. And the outcome of that struggle, it's really uncertain. It's a reminder that technology is reshaping the world in ways that we're only beginning to understand.
For sure. This whole Russia Bitcoin situation, it feels like a wake-up call for the U.S., like a sign that the global landscape is shifting.
Yeah.
And the old rules might not apply anymore.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's definitely a sign of the times. And it wouldn't be surprising at all to see the U.S. becoming much more proactive in shaping global crypto regulations in the next few years. They're going to want to maintain their influence and make sure that crypto doesn't pose a threat to their interests.
Right. We've been talking a lot about these big picture implications, but let's bring this down to earth a bit. You mentioned earlier that there are some really interesting examples of how crypto is already being used in international trade. Can you give us some specifics?
Sure. One area where we're seeing a lot of activity is in cross-border payments, particularly remittances. Companies like BitPesa and Abra are using blockchain technology to offer faster and cheaper ways to send money across borders, especially to places where traditional banking infrastructure is limited.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I've heard about those services.
Yeah.
And they seem like they could be a game changer for people who rely on remittances, especially in developing countries, where those transfer fees can be a huge chunk of their income.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual transactions either. We're also seeing companies start to explore the use of crypto for larger-scale international trade settlements. For example, there have been some pilot projects with companies like Maersk and IBM using blockchain platforms to streamline supply chain management and cross-border payments.
So it sounds like this technology has the potential to not just change who controls the money, but also fundamentally change how global trade operates.
That's exactly it. We're potentially witnessing a shift in how global commerce is conducted, and crypto is a central part of that. But we have to be realistic. There are definitely some downsides and risks associated with this, especially when we're talking about something as complex and potentially volatile as crypto.
Right. Like what kinds of risks?
Well, security is a major one. We've seen some pretty high-profile hacks and thefts of crypto assets, and that raises questions about how safe and reliable these systems really are. And then there's the issue of regulatory uncertainty. Governments around the world are still trying to figure out how to approach crypto, and that lack of clear rules can create a lot of confusion and potentially even hinder innovation.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And of course, we can't forget about the environmental impact.
Right.
Bitcoin mining especially uses a ton of energy, and that's raised concerns about its sustainability.
You're right. Those are all valid points. It's crucial to acknowledge these potential downsides and to address them proactively if we want the benefits of this technology to outweigh the risks.
For sure. So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for crypto in international trade? Is this just a passing fad, or are we really seeing the early stages of a truly transformative technology?
It's tough to predict with any certainty. But I do think it's safe to say that we're just scratching the surface of what's possible as technology continues to evolve. And regulations become clearer, I think we're likely to see even more innovative applications of crypto in global trade and finance.
It's exciting.
It is.
But also a little bit scary.
Yeah, a little bit of both.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, the geopolitical implications, and even some real-world examples. But let's bring this back to you, the listener. What does all of this mean for you, and what should you be paying attention to?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing is to stay informed. This is a rapidly evolving space, and things are changing all the time. Don't just take our word for it. Do your own research. Read articles, listen to other podcasts, follow thought leaders in the crypto space. Really immerse yourself in the information.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to experiment a little. If you're interested in using crypto for remittances or investments or other transactions, there are more and more reputable services popping up all the time.
Exactly. But just like with any financial decision, do your due diligence. Make sure you understand the risks involved and that you're comfortable with the level of security and regulation. And remember, this is just the beginning. We're really at the very early stages of a technological revolution that has the potential to reshape the entire global financial system.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is.
So this is definitely an exciting time to be following this space. What we're seeing with Russia and Bitcoin, it's just one part of a much larger story that's still unfolding.
It is.
All right, so we've covered a ton of ground. But before we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. We've been talking about how Russia is using Bitcoin to navigate sanctions. But is this a sign of a broader trend? Are other countries looking to break free from the U.S. dollar's grip?
It's a huge question, right? Russia's a major player on the world stage. But they're not the only ones looking at alternatives to the U.S. dollar these days.
Oh, definitely not.
I mean, we've already talked about how the European Union is responding, but this whole situation is really causing a lot of different reactions around the world. Some countries are much more open to the idea of embracing crypto, especially those that have a kind of tense relationship with the U.S., or those that are dealing with economic instability. For them, it's a way to become less reliant on the dollar and maybe gain a bit more control over their own financial destinies.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you're already feeling squeezed by the current system, why not explore other options? Especially if those options give you more autonomy and maybe even a chance to level the playing field a bit.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of a multipolar world comes in. Instead of having one dominant currency and one dominant financial system, imagine a world where you have all these different currencies and payment systems, all competing with each other for influence. It's a shift away from a single power center towards a more decentralized and arguably more democratic financial order.
So instead of relying on the U.S. dollar for everything, we might see a world where countries use a mix of currencies for international trade and finance, including crypto.
Yeah.
Almost like a basket of currencies, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, all competing for market share.
That's a great way to think about it. And in this new world, cryptocurrencies could become really significant players. They offer speed and efficiency and a level of autonomy that's very attractive to countries that want to assert their independence.
I can see that. But wouldn't a system like that also be more complex? And maybe even more uncertain, wouldn't make global trade harder to manage
Yeah.
and potentially more volatile.
There's definitely a risk of that. A more fragmented system could definitely lead to more instability, especially in the short term. But there's also the potential for more resilience. If the global financial system isn't so reliant on just one currency, it might be less vulnerable to shocks. You can think of it like diversifying your investment portfolio. If you spread your risk across different assets, you're less likely to be wiped out if one of them takes a nosedive.
Okay, so it's a trade-off then. More flexibility and resilience on one hand, but potentially more volatility and complexity on the other.
Exactly. There's no easy answer. And it's really going to depend on how things play out. But one thing's for sure, the current system is under a lot of pressure. And change is coming. The rise of crypto is just one sign of that.
It's almost like we're watching a financial tectonic shift happening right now.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what the landscape will look like once the dust settles.
It really is a fascinating time to be alive. We're witnessing the potential birth of a whole new financial era, full of both promise and uncertainty.
So bringing it all together, is this the beginning of a full-blown crypto revolution?
I think it's a real possibility. We have all these factors converging at the same time: geopolitical tensions, economic anxieties, and incredibly rapid technological development. It's creating this environment that's ripe for disruption.
And Russia's actions, their decision to embrace Bitcoin, it's like they're throwing gasoline on the fire.
I think that's a good analogy.
It's forcing everyone to pay attention and consider the possibilities, even if they're still skeptical.
Exactly. It's a wake-up call that the world is changing, and the people who are willing to adapt, to think differently and embrace new ideas, they'll be the ones who are best positioned to thrive. The old ways of doing things are being challenged, and it's up to all of us to decide what the future will look like.
So much to think about. If you had to pick one key message, what would you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I'd say the most important thing is to stay curious, stay informed, and don't be afraid to question the status quo. The future of finance is being written right now, and we all have a role to play in shaping it. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just starting to explore the world of crypto, Remember that knowledge is power. The more you understand about these emerging technologies and the forces that are driving change, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this exciting but complex landscape of global finance.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, on that note, we're signing off for today. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Bitcoin, sanctions, and the future of global finance.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Absolutely.
And remember, the best way to predict the future is to create it.